Dust rose that morning in the town square like a faded hymn clinging to the rafters of an old church. The auction yard swelled with sound. Low voices, a whip crack, the shifting of hooves, laughter that stung sharp against the ear. The sun was merciless, pouring itself over raw timber fences and weather-beaten hats. And there, half hidden behind the rails, stood a gray colt with legs bent at odd angles, as if the earth itself had pressed too hard upon its growing bones. Its sides quivered, its head bowed, and it seemed to know the weight of the eyes upon it. Not every creature is born into welcome applause. Some arrive already bowed by shame, waiting to be measured and dismissed. The auctioneer barked words meant to sting. Worthless! Twisted at the knees! Nothing but sorrow in its frame. And the crowd, eager for cruelty, answered with chuckles. A boy tossed a pebble against the boards, and the colt flinched, trembling against its own shadow. Boots scuffed, spurs jingled, and the voices rose like a tide of judgment. "That beast won't last a season," muttered one rancher. "Couldn't plow a furrow if the soil begged." It was not merely an animal being weighed, but dignity itself, held up for ridicule beneath the pale light of noon. Away from the laughter, leaning against the rail, stood Elias Boone, a man built from silence, with calloused hands and eyes that carried the weary distance of a widower's grief. He did not laugh. Instead, he studied the colt with a kind of haunted patience, as though looking upon an old memory stitched back into flesh. His own youth had been marked by a fall from a wagon, bones left crooked and nights filled with jeers. He knew the sound of mockery, the sharp sting of being less. In the colt's trembling, he heard echoes of his own silence. The bidding faltered. No one wished to waste coin on brokenness. The price dropped until it was no longer a sum, but a sentence. The auctioneer's voice grew flat with disdain, eager to move on, when Elias lifted his hand. A hush fell, followed by laughter sharp as broken glass. "Sold," barked the auctioneer. "Sold to the fool with pity in his pocket." The crowd tittered. Whispers traveled like smoke. "Boone's gone soft. Doesn't know better. He'll starve feeding that cripple." Elias did not answer. He walked forward, slow and unashamed, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. The colt's ears twitched, its body tense, but when his hand touched the lead rope, it did not resist. The fence line faded behind them as the whispers dwindled into memory. Dust stirred beneath Elias's boots as he guided the colt down the long road toward his farm. The evening had come soft and red, the sky breaking open into streaks of fire that seemed to set the horizon aflame. The colt stumbled once, its bent legs struggling against the weight of its own frame, but it leaned just barely toward Elias as though seeking steadiness. He slowed his pace, kept his hand steady. The two of them walked like wounded pilgrims, neither demanding more than the other could give. And in that quiet stretch of road, with no one left to jeer, there was a fragile beginning. The dust swirled about them like a cloak, the silence filled with a promise too small for words. Sometimes the first step toward salvation is nothing more than walking beside the broken, asking nothing in return, holding fast to the faith that even shame can be led gently into the dusk. Morning came gentle over the Boone farm, the kind of morning where mist clung low and the air smelled of wet soil and hay. Elias rose early, his hands stiff from years of labor, and stepped into the barn where the colt waited. The animal lifted its head, ears flicking, uncertain but present. Elias had named it Ashen, for the gray of its coat that shimmered like smoke in the dawn light. Its legs were bent, crooked, betraying it with every shift of weight, yet in its eyes lived a stubborn glint. Elias touched its mane and whispered, not words meant for grandeur, but simple murmurs, the way a man might speak to himself when no one else remains to listen. Every day became a litany of care. He rubbed the twisted joints with oil, guided Ashen step by step along the soft dirt, and spoke to it as though each hoofbeat were a prayer. There were falls, hard, dusty collapses that left the colt trembling, sweat slicking its sides. But there was always the rising too, clumsy and slow yet certain. Elias learned to measure time not in hours or days, but in the length of each stride the colt managed before faltering. The sun's arc became their metronome, hope stitched into the sound of breath and hoof, breath and hoof. Each dawn was a hymn of endurance sung without a voice. Still, the world beyond the farm was not silent. At the general store, men leaned against barrels, trading laughter at Boone's expense. "He feeds a cripple while his fences rot," one said. Another spat tobacco juice into the dust. "That horse won't carry him nowhere but deeper into ruin." Elias heard, though he did not answer. He kept his gaze low, collected his supplies, and walked home. At night he felt the weight of their scorn pressing in, the familiar echo of ridicule he had known as a younger man. Yet when he returned to Ashen's pen and saw the colt lift its head at the sound of his boots, he found enough reason to continue. Small victories stitched themselves into the weeks. Ashen managed a stretch of steady steps without stumbling. Later it trotted for the length of the field, awkward but proud. Elias stood at the fence, his throat tight, a warmth stirring inside him he had not felt in years. He did not cheer. He simply placed his hand on the rail and breathed deep, letting the sight settle into his bones. That night he left an extra handful of grain in Ashen's trough, and the colt's soft muzzle brushed his palm in quiet thanks. Not everyone in town turned their back. Clara May, the widow who kept the bakery, passed by Boone's farm one afternoon. She saw Ashen hobbling across the yard under Elias's watchful eye. There was no grandeur, no miracle, just a man, patient and steady, teaching the broken how to stand again. She left a loaf of warm bread on his fence post without knocking. Days later, another loaf appeared, this time wrapped in a cloth embroidered with fading roses. Elias noticed her too, the way her eyes lingered, the way she offered kindness without expectation. It was not love declared in sudden words, but in gestures quiet as falling snow. One evening, as Ashen found its rhythm beneath the swelling colors of sunset, Clara lingered by the fence. Elias tipped his hat, and she returned the gesture, her smile small but certain. Between them, silence carried more weight than conversation. Ashen's legs struck the earth in a pattern almost true, almost proud, and in that moment something unspoken bridged the space between man and woman, creature and caretaker. Weeks bled into months, and the town gathered for the autumn fair. The air buzzed with fiddle music, the smell of roasted meat, the chatter of neighbors eager for spectacle. There were horse trials, contests of speed and strength, where ranchers showed off their proudest stock. When Elias led Ashen to the grounds, whispers broke like storm winds. "That's the cripple from the auction," someone muttered. "Boone's lost every drop of sense." The auctioneer himself smirked, shaking his head as if to say the world never learns. But then, the colt stepped forward. Not with perfection, no. The legs still bore their twist, the gait uneven. Yet Ashen trotted with its head high, mane catching the sunlight, carrying itself not as an object of pity, but as a creature with dignity. The laughter faltered, then fell silent. The crowd watched, spellbound, as the colt circled the arena, crooked but unbowed, guided by Elias's steady hand. The sound of hooves against dirt was not the clatter of failure, but the drum of survival. Clara's hand pressed against her heart, her eyes wet with quiet triumph. No prize was given, no ribbon tied. But when Elias walked Ashen from the ring, the crowd parted in silence, and in their silence lay respect. Those who had mocked found their voices stilled. Those who had pitied now saw strength where they once saw shame. Elias touched the colt's neck, feeling the tremor of life and will beneath its skin, and for the first time in many years, his chest filled with something greater than survival. It was pride. It was hope. And so the story lingers, not in trophies or in gold, but in the way a man chose to stand beside the broken and found, in that choosing, the power to mend his own fractures. We are all born with crookedness somewhere in our bones, some flaw that bends us against the easy path. But with patience, with love, the bent can still rise to meet the sun. And sometimes it is the broken who teach the rest of us how to stand tall.